basically, there were certain times in American history where the American government told people, and this was particularly true, say, in Oklahoma, where they said, you get there first, the land is yours. And so that's why we call people from Oklahoma Sooners, because they were all lined up in a line, and on a particular day, they had their covered wagons and everything, they were told, you can go, and rush to claim land. And some of the people left early, and cheating, in other words. And they're called Sooners, because a lot of people in Oklahoma were Sooners. Although Oklahoma is a beautiful country, don't misunderstand me, but it's a really flat place. You know, I don't know how you can tell one place from another in Oklahoma. Anyone here from Oklahoma? You're from Oklahoma?
No.
No?
I'm really not. I'm from the States, but it's really a dark question. There's actually a really confusing and confusing passage about the free land thing, because it's saying, but if the influence of free land may be considered significant in the shaping of American character and national history, it is possible that the effect of free security might profitably be studied for contributions to the same end. I'm sorry, I don't know what that is.
Okay, what we're just doing is he's juxtaposing the idea of free land with free security.
Okay.
Now, what free land really translates into, in terms of the way American culture evolves, free land translates into freedom. We're completely free. There are no constraints, not even any property constraints, okay? You go out and you homestead, that land becomes yours. So, and understand that property is a huge constraint in most human societies. If you look at all other places where people live, the people have been there for centuries and centuries and centuries. You just can't go places and grab land because you'll be stealing someone else's land. Now, in a very real and profound sense, the Americans were stealing land. They were stealing land from the Native American nations, okay? But the Americans didn't think of it that way. And after 1831, legally, they weren't stealing land any longer because all the land belonged to the federal government and not to the North American nations. So with this idea of free land, freedom works really well. Freedom is an easy value for Americans because you don't bump up against anyone else. Freedom is a much more difficult value if you live in a densely populated area, okay? Because you're always bumping into someone else. I mean, the classic definition of freedom is John Stuart Mill's. You know, I am free to swing my arm as far as Rebecca's nose, okay? And once I hit Rebecca's nose, I'm no longer free to do that. Now, if I'm very, very far away from Rebecca, I can swing my arm all I want, you know? And that's freedom. So freedom works well for American culture. Now, free security is completely different. Free security means that you don't worry about someone coming to beat you up, some outsider invading you, stealing your property, stealing your land, stealing your children, you know, things of that sort. That means you don't really worry about defense. So, I mean, that translates into a completely different aspect of American culture, which is, in some sense, the sense of American invulnerability, which is punctured at Pearl Harbor and punctured again on September 11th. Because the Americans view that as not just an attack, but a gross impertinence, if you will. Other countries are used to being attacked. It happens all the time. So does that help? Any other questions? Yeah?
On the Sochi article, was the history of Sochi a consideration for Russia when they chose it as a place to host the Olympics?
I can't answer that question. The question was, did the history of Sochi factor into the Russian decision to have the Olympics at Sochi? I don't know. I mean, obviously, I mean, But you couldn't have picked a more inflammatory place for the rebels of Chechnya and Dagestan than Sochi. And I can't imagine that Putin said, let's piss these guys off. Okay. Doesn't really make me, maybe he did, I don't know. But you know, the attractiveness of Sochi is that it has the Winter Olympic facilities, but it's also a subtropical climate, which means that you can ski in your shorts if you want.
It's 60 degrees at the Olympics. Like,
Yeah,
they
you know,
have no snow.
I have no idea what the Olympic skiers think about this.
They take pictures from the top of the courses, and it's really funny because all of the other mountains just have like a little bit of snow across the top, and then it's just green the entire way down, except for right where they're skiing.
Yeah, well, they stored snow for over a year.
And it's still no snow, and it's still really bad snow.
Well, I don't know. I mean, ask the Olympic Committee, ask Putin. I can't answer your question, but it's a very good question.
The skiers are saying that kind of regardless is the amount of the glare of the sun, how warm it is, and it changes the snow, that it's affecting their performance, their ability to go up to their normal levels. So it's not effectable or productive way to have the
Well, you know, I mean, snow is always a tough variable in the Olympics. I mean, sometimes you go to other places and the snow is really, really icy. You know, sometimes it's slushy. I mean, Winter Olympics are great. I love them. They're beautiful. You know, I just can't comprehend how these people do the stuff they do. Okay, it just blows me away. You know, I'm built for comfort, not for speed.
Have you heard of the Sochi problems hashtag?
The Sochi.
Sochi problems hashtag? Like,
No.
There's a whole
Or Sochi
Twitter
fail.
Sochi, I don't know what it is, but like, yeah, they like take pictures of like their hotels and stuff, and they like complain about it on Twitter. And like, do you think that has to like, I don't know, like they're like, oh, this is horrible, or like, oh, this is so funny, but like, do you think that can contribute to the whole like American-Russian like power struggle thing that's going on right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. Last night I posted the Jason Jones thing on the Daily Show, which I thought was hysterically funny, you know, because you know, Americans are taking a real delight in all the problems with the Olympics, you know, and it's like the Cold War never ended. I'm sorry, that's the wrong place to take delight. You know, these people have been working their whole lives to do the best they possibly can. The only attitude you should have is that you want everything to be perfect for the athletes. The idea that you take pleasure in problems is just crazy to me. I mean, I'm just dazzled by what these people can do. Although I'm pissed that the Canadians beat the United States women's hockey.
It's you, though. Someone asked you.
Exactly. Serious note. Did you see the report? I don't know if you talked about this, but that the Russian officials are denying all the problems, saying that they have surveillance from one of the bathrooms showing that people were leaving in the hotel, leaving with surveillance in the bathroom.
Yeah, it makes you want to take a shower, doesn't it?
But it should raise me.
Hi! Yeah, look,
Should we-
keep the politics out of the Olympics, okay?
Yeah, but it should raise red flags.
Well, don't worry about it. You really, there are more important things to worry about. Just wish the Olympic athletes the best. I mean, they put their lives on the line and they work really hard. They deserve to be supported as much as possible. Yeah.
This is going a little further east into China and the territorial excursions in the Pacific. It's interesting that the United States, for the first time, kind of denounced the Chinese violations of UN sea charters. And it was also the Munich article, I guess, about Aquino, about the Filipino president. How worried do you think other Eastern Asian Pacific countries are about China's incursion? I know there's been some skirmishes with Japan. I mean, why do you think China now is kind of stirring the pot, if you will, in the Pacific?
Well, China is stirring the pot, if you will, because China believes that this is part of China's territory. You know, territory is the most important element of world politics. And the Chinese claim to the South China Sea is not an especially legitimate claim. In other words, they've drawn this 9-dash line And they've argued that historically this is the extent of Chinese influence. The 9-dash line doesn't conform to any international law ever since the time of Grotius, if you will. I mean, it's a unilateral assertion of sovereignty. So my only suspicion is that the Chinese are testing. They're just basically trying to figure out what they can get away with. And it's like any bargaining position. You start out with an extreme position, and then you move back. If I'm wrong, and the Chinese are going to hold to that 9-dash line, then we're in big trouble. Because there have already been armed battles that have been fought in the South China Sea between the Chinese and the Vietnamese, and between the Chinese and the Filipinos. And the United States is going to be dragged into that conflict. Because the United States has commitments to Japan, to all the countries in that region. And they want the United States there as a counterbalance to China. Now, China must know that. So China must know that by pushing into shove, it's going to push the Americans in. I'm not sure that the Chinese want to do that. So you're asking me to predict the future? I can't. But this is a dangerous game. My suspicion is that it's only dangerous in appearance. There's an underlying reality where all sides will pull back. Any other questions? Last question.
I have a question on one of your blog posts about how the United States is considering launching a legal strike against a U.S. citizen living abroad. My question is there any kind of precedent for a strike like that? Has anything of that nature happened before? And is there anything that they can use to really justify that if they just have to go through with it?
It has happened once before. The United States has killed an American citizen in Yemen. An American citizen by the name of Al-Awlaki, who was broadcasting radio shows from Yemen, arguing for an armed struggle against the United States, urging armed attacks against the United States. This is a highly contested legal arena, okay? According to the Constitution, all American citizens have a right to trial. But you're not going to be able to try someone for advocating armed violence against the United States if they're in a hostile territory. President Obama has argued that he has the right inherent in the commander-in-chief role to eliminate enemies of the state. Now, as long as that enemy is a non-US citizen, no one's going to contest that. The blurring comes, well, what happens if that enemy is an American citizen? Do we accede to the commander-in-chief powers, or do we accede to the due process powers? The Constitution doesn't give us any way to make a decision between those two. Now, what we hope is that there are sort of like judicial procedures that are going on within the executive branch, that the Department of Justice is performing something of a trial, presenting evidence to President Obama about the danger of this individual, and that Obama is acting not as a president, but as a judge under these circumstances. That's dangerous territory. That's really dangerous territory, because we can sort of close our eyes as long as they're isolated individuals in foreign countries. But then things become a little blurry. Well, what if they're advocating armed violence within the United States, but we can't find them, or they're inaccessible for some reason? They're in a bunker. Can we then have a drone strike against them on American soil? Well, if that's true, then you're giving the president an awful lot of power to do things to American citizens without due process. So, this is all really, really murky. But you all have to be aware of this. Because I suspect that these circumstances are going to become more rather than less common.
I think you made an interesting point trying to sort of play on the emotion of the listener, the reader, but he made some comment about taking out a sniper rifle, shooting on an open crowd in the article. He's saying that just like you would take out any sniper rifle that was openly, trying to cause harm to citizens, it's the same thing like you take out somebody else. But I'm wondering, even in a process where there's some sort of hostage situation, or there's some sort of whatever, there's usually some sort of process where they try to, extract the people without harm. So is there any thought going into, can we capture that person? If we can we do something to get them out of there and put them in a process?
Presumably there are. I mean, I don't know how many of you saw that videotape of the U.S. security forces kidnapping al-Libi in Libya. It was remarkable. Al-Libi was a terrorist associated with bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and in Uganda in 1998. And the United States had been looking for al-Libi for years and years and years. They finally located him in Tripoli, in Libya. And they released a videotape 2 days ago showing this van coming up on a street in Tripoli, grabbing this guy, throwing him in the van, and then taking off. And it was done in less than 60 seconds. It was remarkable how that happened. Okay, so we know you can kidnap people, but it took the United States something like 21 years to get out of it. You want to wait 21 years for someone who's armed and fostering violence against the United States?
What does that 21 years to find him? They have to know where the person is to kill him.
You have to know where he is. When they killed al-Awlaki, he was at a radio station. So they knew where he was. They blew him up in the radio station.
You said once before we mentioned al-Awlaki, but are you not counting his son because he wasn't the intended target? Because his son was killed in the second
You're right.
but he wasn't the intended target?
He wasn't the intended target.
So are you not counting that?
Yeah. I mean, there might have been other people who were killed as well. I don't know. All right, let's get back to the course. We're going to try to breeze through the 19th century today. An amazing feat, but one that we have to do because we're falling behind. 3 major events that we have to talk about before we get up to the Spanish-American War. The first is the largest land acquisition of the United States, which was the Louisiana Purchase. And that occurs in 1803. The United States buys this territory from France. And it's an interesting story because Napoleon was the leader of France at the time. And Haiti was a French colony. But there had been a slave rebellion in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, an incredible slave rebellion, which petrified all the slaveholders in the world. I mean, the British were astonished, the French were astonished, the Americans were astonished. I mean, if you're a slave owner, you're really worried about slave rebellions. Because there were far more slaves than there were owners, far more. So Toussaint Louverture leads this rebellion, kills a whole bunch of the French colonists in Haiti. And Napoleon sends French troops to put down the rebellion. But the French troops get slaughtered, not only by the slaves, but also by yellow fever in Haiti. And Napoleon essentially says, we got to give up on Haiti. It's because he needs money to fight the war in Europe. France, as you well know, is waging an aggressive war in Europe at the time, and it's very, very expensive for Napoleon. So he considers his options as, let's pull out of Haiti so I can bring the troops back to France, and then let's get rid of our holdings in North America so I can focus all my attention in Europe, because he really wanted to take care of Europe. So he sells the Louisiana territories to the United States for $15 million, which works out to 3 cents an acre. 3 cents an acre. The best deal you could possibly imagine. I mean, it's just sort of extraordinary. Now, Louisiana is really important to the United States. And Jefferson's the president at the time. Because for the United States, its future, my thinking doesn't work. Its future is in the Mississippi River. The United States is going to be an agricultural country. This is before the age of industry. And the United States has to get the benefits of the Great Plains to port. Getting it to the East Coast is very, very difficult. And it's going to stay difficult until we build the Erie Canal, which allows then people to ship their goods up the St. Lawrence River and over to Europe. But until you build the Erie Canal, it's almost impossible to go the northern route. So the United States has got to ship everything down the Mississippi River. This is the main transportation infrastructure of the United States. New Orleans is therefore the most important port for the United States. The future of the United States rests upon New Orleans. Now, what's interesting about that is that this is always going to be true for the United States. The Gulf of Mexico is always going to be viewed as a national security location for the United States because you have to protect New Orleans. Cuba, and we're going to get to Cuba at the end of this lecture, offers an opportunity for someone to blockade the Gulf of Mexico. Cuba is owned by the Spanish, okay? The United States doesn't really worry about Spain because it's so weak. But ultimately, Cuba always represents a threat to the agricultural potential of the United States. If Cuba is held by a hostile power, then New Orleans can be blockaded and the United States can't sell its exports. This becomes really, really apparent in 1962. And the occasion of what? The Cuban Missile Crisis. It's one of the reasons why the United States is so exercised about Cuba. So don't underestimate the importance of Cuba. Now, getting this land was a remarkable godsend to Jefferson. I mean, all of a sudden he doesn't have to worry about the legal claim of the United States to this huge territory. This is the benefit of working in an imperial framework, okay? I mean, something like this could not happen now. Something like this should not happen now. Something like this should not happen then, but it was practice at the time. France was held to be the owner of this territory. It could do as it pleased with the territory. And Napoleon needed the cash, and he got it. Now, Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark to try to map out this region, and their chronicles are just amazing, just absolutely amazing. What they find, what they're looking for, a really good insight into the development of the frontier mentality of the American culture. It sort of opens up whole new vistas, and this is essentially what Woodward means in terms of free land. 3 cents an acre to the federal government. The federal government could afford to give it away for nothing. Not important. It's more important that we have a place for the growing population of the country. Okay, any questions about the Louisiana Purchase? Or anything you want to say?
Is that after the slave rebellion?
This is after the slave rebellion, yeah. This Louisiana Purchase happens in Louisiana in 1803. And there are lots of slave rebellions in the Caribbean. Toussaint Louverture is the most successful, and he's a real hero in Haiti.
So to what extent were the French in that land before it was sold?
They weren't. you were just talking about French trappers, basically. You know, and the French presence in Canada persists. And they had gone down the Mississippi. And you know, the French had put boundary markers along the Mississippi. But then it was sold. But the French remained in Canada, in Quebec. And they're still there. And still assertive. What's funny about being assertive? Are you a Quebecois?
No, that's true.
Next event, 1823. 1823 is the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is one of the most misunderstood policies of the American government. It's important to understand that there are two phases to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is typically thought of as an assertion of American hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. And this is certainly true after Theodore Roosevelt. This is exactly how Theodore Roosevelt interpreted the Monroe Doctrine. He claims, and Franklin Roosevelt subsequently reclaims, that the Monroe Doctrine gives the United States authority in the Western Hemisphere, that is, authority over Canada, Mexico, Central America, and Latin America, that other nations cannot have. But in 1823, that was not the reason why Monroe issued his doctrine. Monroe issues his doctrine because the British asked him to. In the 1820s, Latin America had gone through its independence. Simón Bolívar was the leader of the independence movement, and all of a sudden, you had newly independent states in Latin America. And these countries were following, essentially, the same Enlightenment ideals of the United States Revolution. And the aspiration of Bolívar was to create republics, similar to the French Republic and similar to the American Republic. But Spain did not like the fact that it was kicked out of the Western Hemisphere, but it was too weak to reassert its claim to these colonies. In 1823, the French, trying to resurrect the vestiges of that decrepit institution called the Habsburg Empire, which should have died many, many, many centuries before, makes an overture to the Spanish. And they say, you ally with us, and we will help you get your Spanish colonies back. Now, the British viewed the French-Spanish alliance as a strategic threat to British interests in Europe. And what they really wanted to do was to prevent the Spanish and the French from reasserting the Habsburg claims in Europe. So the foreign minister of Britain, George Canning, writes a note to President Monroe. And Canning says, we wish for you to say that you will protect the independence of the new Latin American republics so that Spain will not ally with France. So this is a balance of power game that's being fought out in Europe for purely European objectives. The United States becomes an instrument of British diplomacy to foil the French-Spanish alliance. Monroe issues the declaration, but there is no intention whatsoever of the United States asserting control over the Latin American republics. The United States did not even have a navy at the time. There was no way the United States was going to assert any control over Central America or Latin America. It didn't have the power to do so. But Monroe does this in order to prevent, along with Britain, the French-Spanish alliance. So the doctrine is issued, and the United States proclaims in the Monroe Doctrine that it will defend the independence of the new Latin American republics. Okay, any questions about how the Monroe Doctrine comes about? As I say, when we get later on into the 19th century, Theodore Roosevelt will take the Monroe Doctrine and will say, and all subsequent American presidents will say this. Franklin Roosevelt will say it. Dwight Eisenhower will say it when the United States intervenes in Guatemala in 1954. John Kennedy will say it in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, that the Monroe Doctrine gives the United States authority to regulate affairs in the Western Hemisphere. That was not Monroe's intent at the time.
Ideologically, I know in pragmatic terms that in Navy there's really no point in enforcing hegemony, but because these were kind of Enlightenment-inspired revolutions, was there any kind of ideological support for the spread of democracy, or not?
Absolutely. The United States was favorably disposed toward the independence of the Latin American republics. The United States at this point viewed itself as the vanguard of the new republics. And the United States at this time viewed the destruction of the European empires as an objective. It was an Enlightenment state. And it believed in the imposition of Enlightenment values. Any other questions about the Monroe Doctrine?
It sounds a little imperialistic to me.
Well,
Having authority over the Western.
and I agree that ultimately it's used for imperial purposes. But if you are a Latin American republic, say you're Gran Colombia at the time, and you know that Spain wants you back, would you regard the American assertion of your independence as an imperialistic move?
No, but just the word authority is,
Well, yeah, that's true, but
okay.
Colombia wasn't in any position to defend itself against Spain. I'm not sure that the United States could have helped all that much. The Spanish certainly feared getting the United States involved. So in some sense, the intent of the Declaration was actually anti-imperial. Its effects subsequently become very imperial. But this is because conditions change. Also because by the end of the 19th century, the United States is a significantly more powerful state. And the change by Theodore Roosevelt in asserting that the Monroe Doctrine gave the United States authority is accompanied by the fact that Theodore Roosevelt builds up the American Navy. He single-handedly builds up the American Navy to give the United States power to control events in Latin America. It didn't exist before.
Given that in 1823, the American Navy was not as well established and the American Army was not as well established, how could America ensure that France and Spain couldn't unite to actually invade Latin American and South American countries?
That's an interesting question because, Spain was a very weak power. The United States was a very weak power. France was a very strong power. England was a very strong power. But, your question is, why would the introduction of U.S. power make a difference? Well, it would make a difference to Spain, but it wouldn't make any difference to France. But France didn't have any intention of following through on this deal. France wasn't going to send its troops to restore the colonies to Spanish control. And so the question is, in real terms, did this really make a difference? No. In political terms, it probably did make a difference. Because now Spain has got to face the fact that the United States and Great Britain are united on this particular issue. And the calculation is, well, if the British and the Americans are together on this, will we, the Spanish, have to fight the Brits alone? Or will the French ally with us to fight the Brits in Latin America? And the answer to that is no. The French had their own aspirations in Europe, not in the Western Hemisphere. Any other questions? All right, let's continue to breeze through American history. Next is 1845-46, the war with Mexico. This, for those of you who have read the proclamation by President Polk, understand that this was a fabricated war almost entirely. The United States made up the accusations of aggression by Mexico against American settlers in the region. And Polk uses these accusations as the basis for war. There really was no sustained activity by Mexico against American settlers in the region. This was a very, very hollow claim made by President Polk. However, President Polk felt a great deal of pressure from those who, in that region, wished to become part of the United States. This area, the disputed area, yeah, I'm so pathetic. Here's Texas. This is the area disputed, and the conflict revolves around border attacks in this area. But the people who were settling in the region known as Texas felt a strong affinity with the United States and virtually no affinity with Mexico. They were primarily Anglo. Now, this is interesting because, the Mexicans had been, the Spanish had been in North America longer than the Brits. It's one of those interesting things where everyone thinks about the United States as this Anglo society. Well, not historically. The people who populated a good part of North America were Spanish, and they were here long before the Brits were here. And that's why we have cities called Los Angeles or San Francisco, not the City of the Angels or St. Francis. And so the Mexican population is very, very strong in this region. But the settlers, the people who moved in, felt a strong affinity with the United States. So ultimately what happens is that the settlers are trying to get the United States to intervene to break them away from Mexico. There was a hand here.
Yeah, so in terms of the population of Texas, how much was Spanish and how much was sort of settlement from the colonists?
Most of it was Spanish.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Most of it was Spanish. But the settlers were very, very energetic, shall we say. Okay. The Mexicans had well settled into this region. But when the settlers come in and they see a lot of land that's not being used, and the Mexicans weren't really intent upon using the land the same way the settlers were. It's like seeing a lot of free land, and that's what they want. Particularly when they see the potential for raising cattle. Now, raising cattle requires a huge expanse of territory. You can't do it on small crops, small acreage. You need huge expanses of territory. And so when the settlers come in, they see this new possibility of raising cattle as being the key to their economic prosperity. That's why they want to break away. Polk is moved by the entreaties of the settlers, comes up with these fabricated accusations of atrocities that occur along the Nueces River, and then declares war on Mexico, and basically steals the territory from Mexico. Mexicans put up a good fight. Santa Anna has some strong victories against the Americans, but ultimately American power wins out in this particular struggle. And here you get a lot of myths about things like the Alamo and Sam Houston and Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. A lot of the frontier mythology of the United States is built around the war with Mexico. I remember vividly when I was 6 or 7 years old, running around with a coonskin hat, pretending I was Davy Crockett. It was just amazing how that whole mythology filters into your consciousness, really, really deep.
My grandmother always claims that my family's related to him. She has no basis for that claim, but she always asserts that we're directly related to Davy Crockett.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very powerful narrative in American history. Very, very, very powerful. And it becomes a driving impulse behind a lot of stuff. I mean, just think about how many automobile advertisements you see in what was the Mexican desert. Yeah, you see all these cars driving around in Utah, in Arizona, and you see these buttes and mesas and all. I mean, and it's all an attempt to try to pull us into this frontier mentality. Or the Marlboro man, you know, to sell cigarettes. You know, I mean, it's just powerful, powerful narrative in the American culture. It's unbelievable.
There's one reading, and it was a few weeks back, I'm not entirely sure which one, but there was an argument made that true American culture is frontier culture, and that it's kind of with Manifest Destiny and going westward, that that's the real ethos, the true ethos of America isn't in the East Coast, Eastern Seaboard, but it's in the frontier.
That's Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis.
Yes.
One of the most important monographs ever written in American history. And there's a lot of truth to Turner's argument. The frontier myth becomes a defining myth in American culture.
And in some ways, politically, I think it still has merit. When you look at voting patterns in the U.S., I mean, the hinterlands and the interior have always been, pretty consistently, about autonomy, about, having a less taxed government, less government, and that's still pervasive.
Yeah, I mean, you use the word autonomy, I would use the word freedom. Okay, I mean, this is the libertarian impulse in American politics. And it really comes out of this idea of the frontier and of free land. And Americans believe this very deeply, much more so than any other people on the face of the planet. And this is because of the geographical nature of the American conquest of North America. It is free land. You drive through, the United States, it is massively underpopulated. I mean, it's just unbelievable. You can drive through parts of the United States where you won't see a house for miles and miles and miles and miles. You can't do that in most other countries in the world. There are always a lot of people. So, I mean, this is another aspect to the exceptionalism of the American culture. Now, what's interesting about this is that after the war is won, Texas becomes independent, an independent republic. It becomes the Lone Star Republic, Texas, Republic of Texas. Independent state, independent nation state. And then it decides to incorporate itself into the United States as a state of the United States. But ultimately, because of the outcome of the war, Mexico was forced to cede that area to the west, the overwhelmingly green area, which becomes New Mexico, Arizona, and California. This is the point at which the United States reaches the Pacific. This is the aspiration of the United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific, or to use the song, from sea to shining sea. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that when you look at the composition of the population of this area, here's the population of the area in 2013 or 2011. Population really hasn't changed all that much when you come right down to it. This is something that Americans have a hard time understanding. Again, the narrative, the Anglo myth of the United States is very, very powerful. But, people of Spanish descent have lived in this region much longer than Anglos. And they still comprise a sizable percentage of the population of this region. The war doesn't change the demographics all that much, but it certainly changes the politics profoundly.
What I find interesting though is, at least when you look at Arizona, the point at which the population drops significantly is right on the reservation. And so it's interesting that those two groups are
You mean the Native American nations?
Yes.
Right around Cameron.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
right.
there's the Apache, the Navajo,
Right.
all of those, and so like all of that kind of lighter purple area in northern Arizona, that's all reservation land.
That's all Native American nation, right? You're absolutely right. The demographics are really important here. The Americans tend to ignore demographics because the Americans have been seduced by the idea of the melting pot. And that's again another narrative of the United States. But while the melting pot does have an awful lot of power and a lot of force in American society, there are aspects of the melting pot which simply aren't true. It's much more of a stew than it is of a melting pot.
Coming from Southern California, like ever since like fourth grade, kind of, they like incorporate into all of our social study curriculums like the war with Mexico and like how it influences our like culture. I don't know if we have one, but like if we did, that would be it. And yeah, so like I guess that was like I guess I didn't notice that until like right now.
That didn't used to be the case, but you're right. I mean, the curriculum in California, Arizona, and New Mexico has changed dramatically in the secondary and elementary schools, and much more accurate depiction of the history of the region, and that's good. Being accurate is good. Being truthful is good, even though it's painful. Okay. This war was overwhelmingly supported by the United States, and the Mexicans really were powerless. I mean, here realism reigned supreme. The outcome of the war was never in dispute, never in doubt. And this was a rule by conquest, but hardly contested. I mean, it just sort of rolls out, and it happens. And the integration of these regions into the American political system, occurs rather seamlessly, but that made possible only because of the next major incident in American history, which we don't talk about, which is the American Civil War. The American Civil War in 1861 to 1865 sidetracks American foreign policy profoundly. It's not to say it doesn't have foreign policy consequences, because it does, big time. But the overwhelming preoccupation of the United States in that period, from 1861 to 1865, is to fight the war. The war makes the United States into an industrial nation. And that's the key thing for us. The war creates demands for certain types of things that the Americans begin to crank out in tremendous quantities. And here you begin to see the American infatuation with technology and with innovation, because the demands of the war are so strenuous. All you have to do is to drive about 10 miles down to Springfield, Mass. Go to the Springfield Armory, and you can see the development of small arms that Springfield was responsible for in the American Civil War. It's not an accident that some of the largest arms manufacturers in the world are in Springfield, Mass. And here we cranked out new types of guns so that the war could be fought. The Remington, the Colt, Smith & Wesson, the Gatling gun, all invented in Springfield, Mass. And we have the beginnings of the iron, the development of ironclad machinery. And we do this in terms of ships, building ironclad naval vessels, and you begin to do this in terms of the carriages that are being pulled by the horses. Ultimately, you also, at this time, see the beginning of the American petroleum industry, because the key demand of the Civil War was for lubrication and for illumination. And the petroleum industry provides both of these. The catalyst for the petroleum industry is not gasoline. Gasoline is a toxic byproduct of the first petroleum industry in the United States. They didn't want to have anything to do with gasoline. It was too explosive. But they wanted kerosene, and they wanted the heavy oil for lubrication. The kerosene for lights, because whales were becoming extinct, and the lubrication for the iron wheels that were being used for the carriages. And this was provided by a lot of people in Springfield. Springfield, Mass. Was essentially the heart of the Union military effort. I would encourage you to all go down to the Springfield Armory. It's a very, very well kept museum, and it shows an awful lot of these innovations. It also shows the end of the old style of warfare. It's still practiced in the Civil War, but its most tragic example is, of course, Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, where the Gatling gun proves to be supreme, and the soldiers on horses and the soldiers on foot are doomed. This is something that the whole world witnesses, but doesn't take to heart. And because it doesn't take to heart, the next time the world goes to war, which is in World War I, we see the imbecility of the old style methods of warfare being played out on a grand scale. No one really pays enough attention to the American Civil War, and for that, the Europeans suffer severely. If they had paid attention, they wouldn't have fought World War I the way they did. So much more about the Civil War, but unless you have questions, I'm just going to move on to the Spanish-American War. Okay, once you finish the Civil War, you get rid of the most serious political cleavage in American politics, which of course is the issue of slavery. It had hamstrung the Union for a long period of time. It had made compromise very, very difficult in American politics. It had made the workings of the American political system extraordinarily archaic and difficult. But with the success of the Union armies, that issue becomes moot. Slavery is no longer a defining issue in how the political system is structured, although the legacy of slavery never dies. I mean, it's still a very, very important component of American politics. But from an institutional point of view, you don't have to worry about the garbage of having free states and slave states anymore. And that allows the United States to assimilate the new states, like Arizona, New Mexico, much more easily than would have been the case before. Okay, this brings us to the point at which the United States decides it's going to step out on the world stage. And this is the Spanish-American War. Oh, yeah, I forgot to say, the other thing about the Civil War is this is where the United States buys Alaska. We buy Alaska from the Russians. And the Russians, I mean, I'm sure they regret selling it to us. It is a huge expanse of land, very, very filled with resources. At the time when Seward, the Secretary of State, bought it from the Russians, people thought he was crazy to buy Alaska. Turns out to have been a steal, just like the Louisiana Purchase. Spanish-American War is the last anti-imperial war fought by the United States. It is fought against the Spanish Empire, which, like the Habsburg Empire before it, should have died a long time ago. The Spanish Empire was it was old, it was sclerotic, and it was hardly a vibrant empire. The Spanish-American War, we can go way back to start it, but let's start in 1895. It starts with an insurrection in Cuba by people in Cuba who were opposed to Spanish control. And the people in Cuba wanted to become an independent state. The response of the Spanish government to this insurrection was brutal. The Spanish tried to repress the insurrection by developing an innovation that had been developed by the Americans in the Civil War called concentration camps. The Americans had started the process of concentration camps of isolating civilians and putting them in camps and then letting them die through neglect. The Spanish did the same thing in Cuba. They started rounding up all sorts of civilians, putting them in camps, and then letting them die of neglect. This, however, did not quell the insurrection. As you may well appreciate, it just made the people who wanted the Spanish out more committed to their cause. Stories of the horrors of the concentration camps began to filter into the United States. And by and large, these news reports were facilitated by the development of what we now call yellow journalism. Called yellow journalism because the newspapers were printed on yellow paper, okay? And here we had the development, and this is a corporate note in American society, you have the development of media magnates, people who made a lot of money selling newspapers. This is the beginning of the loose empire, and ultimately loose publications publishes Time magazine, Life magazine, all because a very, very important part of the American culture. We also have the Hearst Corporation, and Hearst publishes a lot of newspapers and still is a dominant force in the American media. But this was the beginning of the media presence in the United States as an institutionalized corporate presence. And both Hearst and Luce decided to compete against each other by publishing lurid stories. And this was always designed to sell newspapers. It's like the British newspapers. On page 3 of a lot of the British tabloids, you will always see a bare-breasted woman. This started a long time ago, and that's how the British press decided to sell its newspapers. You had to go to page 3 because they didn't want it on the front page. But all you had to do was turn one page and you could get titillated. And for some reason, people seem to like this type of media reports. For some reason, we still like finding out about Justin Bieber and a lot of other people who are just ridiculous and stupid, and we don't need to know about them, okay? But this is something that sells newspapers. Well, at this time, what sold newspapers was telling stories of Spanish atrocities in Cuba. And Americans were addicted to the stories about people being killed, women being raped and assaulted in Cuba. And this began to ignite a fury of indignation in the United States. The American people tended to be quite moralistic in their view of empire. And this was a way of condemning the Spanish Empire, that it was behaving in an immoral fashion. And Luce and Hearst fostered this. They did everything they can to whip up public opinion in the United States against the Spanish Empire. Hearst himself sent Frederick Remington, who was a gifted American painter, to Cuba, and asked Remington to write stories and to produce lithographs for the newspaper. And at one point, Remington wrote back, telegraphed Hearst, and said, "Not much is going on here. Can I come back home to New York?" And Hearst telegraphed him back saying, "Don't worry, you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." That was Hearst's intent. He was going to make this into an event that would sell newspapers. So we get this continuous stream of newspaper stories that Luce and Hearst publish, competing with each other for market share of newspapers, and whipping the American people into this incredible frenzy.
So to be clear, because they were exaggerating so much, was what they were exaggerating something legitimate? Was it one camp or thousands of camps, or?
Let me put it to you this way. There were terrible horrors that were committed by the Spanish in Cuba. You didn't have to do anything to dress them up. But this is what Luce would do. And there's a very famous lithograph. There was a story about a Spanish woman, not a Cuban woman, and this is very important because obviously there's an element of racism that plays into this. A Spanish woman who was arrested by Spanish authorities and who was stripped naked to find out whether or not she was carrying messages. Okay? Now, we don't know the circumstances in which this happened. My suspicion is that, when women are arrested, they usually have a female authority do the strip search. A matron. She comes in, she does it. We don't really know the details of how this happened. Luce publishes a lithograph of a naked woman standing there, and all you could see are her buttocks because she didn't want to show anything other than the buttocks, okay? Ooh, inappropriate. With all these leering men over her, okay? So, yes, this woman was strip searched. No question about that. Was she strip searched in that way? We don't know. Okay. So, yeah, atrocities occurred, and some of them were really, really bad, not just strip searching. I mean, the concentration camps were really bad. But there are ways to play this, and you can think about all those young boys who just took that front page and went back someplace, just let their fantasies play out. It's crazy, just crazy. Well, this whips up into a frenzy, and President McKinley ultimately is forced to send a U.S. naval vessel to Cuba to investigate the atrocities. He sends the USS Maine into the Havana harbor. And it is a statement of the U.S. interest in the conduct of the Spanish government in Cuba. While the USS Maine is docked in the harbor, there's an explosion that occurs on the Maine, and it sinks. And hundreds of American sailors are lost. And this is viewed as an act of aggression by the Spanish government against the United States. Now, no one really knows exactly, no one did know at the time exactly what happened. At the time, people said the Spanish government blew it up. People came, put a mine on the outside of the ship's hull, and blew it up and sank it. Some people said, no, this was the Spanish insurrectionists who were trying to goad the United States into supporting them. And they're the ones that placed the mine on the outside of the hull. And then a third theory was that there was an internal explosion to the vessel. And it was just bad seamanship on the part of the sailors of the USS Maine. No one knows exactly what's happening. The press immediately interprets it as a Spanish attack on an American vessel, saying, we are now at war with the Spanish government because they have attacked an American vessel and killed American soldiers, sailors. Subsequently, the USS Navy sent an investigating force down to Havana to look at the USS Maine. And they went down and they looked at the hull. And the hull had been exploded from the inside out, not from the outside in. So all you have to do is look at the way the metal is bent to figure out whether it was from the inside out or the outside in. So it was an internal explosion on the USS Maine that sunk the Maine. Someone had not handled the ammunition on the ship properly. And that's what killed the sailors. But at the time, no one knew this. So McKinley goes to the Congress and asks for a declaration of war against the Spanish government. Let me stop there and see what questions you have.
Well, just because it's blown up from the inside, how do they know that it wasn't malicious? I mean, someone can go inside and blow it up.
Yeah, that's a possibility. say the sailors were on guard and it wasn't sabotage or anything like that. It might have been one of the sailors themselves that sabotaged it. But basically you say the inference is, because it occurred inside, you assume something benign.
They didn't have any further investigation. They didn't have any, diplomacy attempts in Spain. No, nothing. Just
There were telegrams that were sent back and forth. The U.S. ambassador, demanded information, but understand that you can't send in an American investigating force into a zone where a war is likely. I mean, you weren't going to send in your investigating force for them to get arrested by the Spanish government. So you don't do this until after the war is over. So,
well, after the war is over, you spent a lot of money, you spent a lot of lives, you wasted a lot of time.
yeah, that's true. That's true. You're assuming that people didn't want the war to happen. Okay? If you don't want the war to happen, maybe that's what you'll do. But if you do want the war to happen, you don't really care. Now, what's interesting about this, the war, McKinley goes to the Congress, and he does exactly what the Constitution demands. The ship is blown up on the 15th of February in 1898. Just 2 days from now, we'll have the anniversary of the blowing up of the Maine. And then on April 25th, the president goes to the Congress and asks for a declaration of war. And McKinley goes and asks for a declaration of war against the Spanish Empire. There are, however, lots of parts to the Spanish Empire. McKinley is primarily concerned about Cuba because that's what's been going on. But unbeknownst to McKinley, the Undersecretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, who has been building up the American naval fleet for years, had ordered Admiral Dewey to sail to the Philippines. This is before the declaration of war. And Roosevelt was certain that a war would be declared, and he wanted Dewey to be in position to fight the war against the Spanish Empire in the Philippines when the war was declared. So he has Dewey near Manila Harbor on April 25th when war is declared. Dewey sails into Manila Harbor on April 27th, 2 days after the declaration of war. Now understand, the Philippines is about 6,000 miles away from the United States. And so Roosevelt had planned this. This was a planned war. Roosevelt wanted to defeat the Spanish in the Philippines. And it wasn't even a contest. Dewey sails into Manila Harbor on April 27th. On May 1st, there's the Battle of Manila Bay. The Spanish ships are wooden ships. The American ships are ironclad ships. The Americans slaughter the Spanish. It destroys the entire Spanish fleet. And Dewey has only 8 men wounded in the clash. But the entire Spanish fleet is at the bottom of Manila Harbor. And this is where, there was a very famous episode where the Spanish sailors are in the water in Manila Bay, and the American sailors are standing on their ships, and they're sort of cheering because they won. And Dewey realizes that this was a slaughter. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. And Dewey tells his men, don't cheer, boys, they're dying. Dewey understands that this was not a good thing. But the Spanish capitulate almost immediately in the Philippines. The situation in Cuba is far different. Okay? The United States had not anticipated going to war. McKinley hadn't even prepared going to war. When the war is declared, the United States Army, at the time, on April 1898, the U.S. Army had 28,000 men. That's all. It didn't even have summer uniforms for these soldiers. When they sail to Cuba, they are wearing winter gear. They are wearing their wool clothes. When they sail to Cuba, they have no idea how they're going to offload their horses to the cavalry. And when the ships finally reach Havana Harbor, and Santiago Harbor, basically the U.S. Navy says, well, just open the doors and the horses will swim to shore. And they all drown. You know, so you have two wars. The War of the Philippines, exquisitely planned, exquisitely prepared for, absolutely decisive. The war in Cuba was something out of Bozo land, okay? The United States really had not prepared for it, didn't understand what was going on, and had no